I like them.
It's so great to have my new glasses because now before they were very thin, so you couldn't see my eyes, so I didn't like to wear them when I was doing these interviews. Anyways, this is so nice. I can see you. I can see my notes. This is great.
All right.
So
Well, they look good, I gotta say.
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it definitely.
Thank you. So welcome everybody. I'm Stephanie Erickson. I'm a clinical social worker and the author of Plan for Aging Well. And today we're going to talk about a topic that can be very difficult to face, to deal with, to feel. But in the end, if used wisely, it can actually help us heal and grow, repair relationships. And that is the concept of suffering. Um, and this is not, by the way, going live on LinkedIn. I can see that it didn't work. So bummer, but I'll post it after. But at least we're live on Facebook. So the concept of suffering is something that I can attest to personally. In fact, I did a TED talk about the concept and the word of suffering because I used to say that I suffer from anxiety. And I think that word alone was impacting the way that I was experiencing anxiety. And so now I've changed it to I live with anxiety. But that's more about the word. But I think that the word suffer implies so much for people. There's the different levels of pain in my experience and suffering. It's, the physical suffering, the aches, the pains, the ailments, the illness. There's the emotional suffering and the psychological suffering, the suffering within a relationship. And of course, there's spiritual suffering when we are looking for meaning and we don't find meaning in ourselves and in our life and relationships. And for me, this concept of the layers of suffering, I first learned about it and experienced it as a professional when I was working in hospice. And today he's a faculty at San Francisco University. And let me get your full bio. He's got his PhD. He's associate professor of psychology and former dean of undergraduate studies at Golden Gate University. Sorry, wrong university, I said. Oh, but you're also faculty at the University of San Francisco.
Yeah,
okay.
That's right.
You teach in the nursing school and the religious studies department. I'm so happy you're teaching in the nursing school department about this concept because, boy, are nurses hands-on with patients all the time. Yeah. You also serve as the chair of the San Francisco End of Life Network, which is a community-based support and education group for hospice and palliative care professionals. And you're also a psychotherapist helping clients in a variety of ways. This is Dr. Nate Hinerman or Hinerman, which is the way you say it?
Hinerman's fine. Any way you say it's okay with me.
Well, if I said Dr. Nate Smith, that probably wouldn't be okay.
It's all right. There's probably a Dr. Nate Smith out there too.
There probably is. If we Google, there's probably many. So can I call you Nate today? Is that all right with you?
Sure, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Well, our first conversation was more casual too. So Nate, talk to me about suffering. I know that you've volunteered and still volunteer in the hospice community. You see patients or clients in a private practice. So I'm sure you're very familiar with the feeling of suffering. For you as a clinician and for you as a researcher, what does suffering mean?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm grateful to be with you, and I've enjoyed our previous conversation, and so I'm looking forward to the meaning making that we'll co-create here in this next 30 minutes. But yeah, I just would start off by saying, early on in my graduate work, I was curious about suffering, both from a personal perspective, but just looking out at the world. And early on, I wondered whether it was possible to even say something new about suffering. I asked questions like, do we drain suffering of meaning if we were to really analyze it or objectify it or categorize it or look at it from a safe distance? Those are some of the early questions or sort of wonderments that I had about entering into this landscape. And from that point, my research really began to look at contexts in which suffering might be transformed and to really ponder insights about suffering to the extent that we could locate those and to discover perhaps what prevents us from more deeply exploring our mutual fate, if you'd like. So going back to what you said earlier very well, we all know that pain, for example, doesn't equal suffering. Certainly pain is associated with suffering often, but it's possible to experience pain, I think, and not suffer. And so if you look at, denotative approaches or definitions of suffering, you get things like to undergo hardship, to feel pain, to have a disease or a condition, perhaps to endure or even undergo. And there are some archaic definitions also that come from more Latinate roots that suggest that suffering, the early understandings, had more to do with allowing. And so all that being said, suffering, I think, is something to be borne, something to be carried. I really like Eric Cassell in The Nature of Suffering and the Goals of Medicine, where he writes, suffering, is the state of severe distress associated with all sorts of events and feelings, experiences that threaten the intactness of our personhood. And what I like about Cassell's definition of suffering is that really, suffering oftentimes arises as almost an assault on our integrity. And I don't mean that in a moral sense, but in the sense that we have wholeness, or we aspire to wholeness in our lives. And in that way, we all carry, with us a kind of idea of ourself that extends backwards into our narrative and also looks forward into the future. And so when our intactness, if you'd like, of our narrative is threatened by an event, a condition, a context, and so on, I think, that can induce a kind of severe distress, a kind of severe suffering. So oftentimes I think, when we're talking about this topic of suffering, it's really almost more helpful to look at it metaphorically. So the geography of suffering oftentimes includes a felt sense of meaninglessness or affliction, forlornness in a protracted manner, alienation, as you mentioned, could be physical, could be psychosocial, could be intellectual, felt sense of powerlessness, purposelessness. And so, in my work, I don't attempt to generate, new theodicies or to try and look for necessarily new answers to why suffering exists, although I do hold those questions closely. But I think a more phenomenological approach to suffering, for me, made the most sense. That is to say, to look at concrete ways in which suffering is experienced, manifested, and then to look at the ways in which perhaps meaning could be taken from the experience of suffering by various individuals and communities.
Okay, so there's this, as you're explaining, you use so many different adjectives to describe how different people perceive and define suffering. And I think one of the things that speaks to is it's very individualized for different people.
That's right.
So what I see in my work as a caregiver might say to me, my dad is suffering from dementia. But then when I talk to the staff, the person has a diagnosis of dementia, but they don't seem to be suffering at all. They don't seem to be struggling, living day to day, confusion, disorientation, agitation, discomfort. They actually seem to be settled into whatever their reality is. So it's the caregiver's perception versus the patient, let's say, who's experiencing it. So in a more
Very well said.
in a more practical, hands-on, clinical way, can you describe to me in your work what does
Yeah.
suffering look like? I know what I can say personally and what I've seen professionally, what I see when I think people are suffering, what it looks like to me. But I'm curious from your perspective, so not as a
Yeah.
researcher, but as that therapist or working in the hospice setting, what do you see?
Okay, fair question. And before I answer that directly, because I want to, and it's an important question, can I just take 2 minutes and try and talk about a little bit as to what occludes suffering in the clinical, or the perception of suffering in clinical settings?
Okay, sure, of course.
So, one of my particular interests in suffering comes from bioethics, which is an academic discipline that I participate in. So over the last 25 years, I've been struck by the fact that so many bioethical approaches, don't even include the word suffering. So I've got, you don't see it here in this particular room, but I've got thousands of books in my little flat in San Francisco, and in all these ethical volumes, it may shock you to know that the word suffering usually doesn't even appear, not even as an entry in the index. And so we have already in sort of our academic landscape, whether it's in nursing or when you're becoming a physician, these ethical systems that leave the problem of suffering and all these sort of related concepts that you're pointing to, like endurance and courage and assessment, to sort of particular theological traditions. And so why is this? Why do so many bioethicists sort of approach this notion that somehow suffering is, not something to speak to directly? I think in part.
And I just want to, just before
Yeah.
you finish that, I want to say that that has some serious implications in the healthcare setting. Because if
Yes.
we're talking about, advanced directives and making medical decisions to relieve someone's what we perceive as suffering or their suffering, but that doesn't meet criteria in the legal sense. So that's an interesting piece of how do you evaluate and measure suffring,
Yes,
Anyways,
I
that was kind of
totally
a
agree.
side note. Yeah.
That's a crucial point that you just made. And I think we should retrieve that. I just think that, because bioethicists oftentimes sort of approach suffering with a kind of simple syllogistic logic. Suffering's bad. Bioethics is out there to try and help people. Therefore, bioethics has a duty to help people avoid suffering. And so suffering is something to be avoided. And if it's not avoided, it's something perhaps to be downplayed or perhaps ignored. Or decentered, maybe pushed to the margin where a priest or a rabbi could intervene, but it doesn't seem to be the clinical focus of much of our attention, even in psychotherapy. But we'll come back to that. So, of course, though, missed in this sort of syllogistic approach is the fact that suffering is inevitable, and it could be theoretically a part of anybody's life. So, in some respects, by fast forwarding through the universality of suffering, I think so much of our medical model misses an opportunity to engage in a deeper exploration of the topic. I think even talking about suffering can help us in many ways understand the nature of persons, understand the relationship between persons and their bodies, understand better the goals of medicine or what they ought to be, the relationship between people and their communities and the place of spirituality perhaps in people's lives. So on the one hand, I don't want to romanticize or be overly sentimental about what suffering can do or the study of it. And on the other hand, I also don't want to encourage or suggest that apathy is appropriate in the face of suffering. In effect, to your good point, I think bioethics in general suffers from a kind of a pathologizing, sometimes of even the human experience. That is to say, the experience of illness is made over through the application of sometimes ethical abstractions that lead to a kind of the construction of a kind of disease pathology.
Yeah.
So we take suffering and we convert it into a DSM-5 diagnosis, for example. And at that point, that's something that's treatable, that we want to extirpate, let's say, from the patient narrative. But the tools that sometimes medicine has, for example, if we're talking about clinical medicine, are insufficient in as much as they're not sufficiently interdisciplinary enough, on the one hand, to really approach the terrain of suffering. And two, a lot of times people aren't trained to actively listen and engage people who may be experiencing a more existential suffering. And so,
yeah,
yes, go ahead.
And let's try and stick on this point, Nate, because I want to make sure, and I know we have limited time, and I want to make sure that we talk about the benefits of suffering, which sounds really weird to say, but and you can see people more and more over time really looking for something to make them feel at peace and feel okay in the world, especially in the last year. And people seem to be searching for something more, something bigger than themselves. And sometimes these crises, these feelings come from a deep level of pain. And so often, I certainly have found for myself that the worst that I've ever felt has always led to the biggest growth and outcomes and evolution. So it's almost like, I'm not saying I hope people suffer, but a certain amount of pain is important to experience and to not run from, and to use that as an opportunity to grow from. So let's put on your clinician or hospice mind and not the researcher bioethics mind, because I want people to feel
Yeah.
for themselves and for people that they're working with, how they can use suffering. So
Yeah.
first, how do you think we can take that experience and build something positive from it? Can we do it on our own? Do we need a professional? Do we need that active listening like you were saying?
Yeah, yes, and yes to all those. So first of all, let me just say I do believe that there are some versions, some experiences of suffering that are indeed world destroying. And suffering, I think, often takes us out of our ordinary lives, if I'm getting you right. And it makes us aware of things that are going on about us or to us that normally don't get noticed. So when you look more deeply into suffering, I think suffering, to your point, if it has an efficacious dimension, can open up at least three different possibilities. That is to say, suffering sometimes brings us into community. Sometimes suffering gives rise to resistance. And I think also suffering can give rise to a kind of quest. And if you'd like, I could go into those, or maybe they're sort of
No, I think
obvious.
no, let's break that down.
Okay,
So
so
and
so
and
cre-
and if you
creating
can go ahead. So go ahead, Nate.
so suffering for one might create a community. So the person who's suffering might see the ground of our common humanity. Someone may recognize that through suffering, above all, that, for example, humans are stirred to love one another. That is to say that the teleology of why we're here and what we should be doing might sort of penetrate the clouds of suffering and empower one to see life anew, to find a particular insight, although achieved in a very difficult way, and yet the insight may be essential. So community can come in all sorts of forms. Maybe it's AA, maybe it's a church community, maybe it's just a community of you and a lover or a brother or a sister or a friend or, yes, a therapist. But that active listening is crucial, and I'd like to come back to that in a second, because that's not always available to folks, although I think it's more available than sometimes we might give rise. Suffering, I think, in addition to sometimes arriving in new communities, can lead to resistance. I can't tell you how many patients I've had over the years who have had, terrible cancers, other life-threatening chronic progressive illnesses, who have said to me, one of the things about this disease is that it's really made me rethink how I want to live my life. And as you and I spoke off camera in another conversation, one of my interests in hospice and palliative care, in large part, is that death, at least for me, the existence of it, and as a result, us as mortal, contingent human creatures, has a particular role as a teacher, in that it, for me, in my journey, has helped me see what's most important often. And so in that way, suffering sometimes can not just provide insight and community, but it tells us when we need to react, when we need to push back, when we need to gather ourselves and perhaps be really assertive, push in new directions, change momentums, change habits of thinking, habits of feeling.
Relationships,
Relationships.
decisions, jobs. I mean, if we're getting down to real
Yes,
practical things,
you bet.
and I think that's a lot of what's happened
Yes,
over the last year for people. It's given people a lot
yes.
of perspective, is what really matters, because all the things that I thought mattered and that I was running around doing or believing or feeling, in the end, now I'm stuck at home with my partner, with my family. This is what's the most important. And as a hospice social worker, I'll tell you, Nate, and I'm sure you've experienced the same thing. On
Yeah,
people's deathbed, they are never saying to me, geez, I wish I had more money in the bank right now. They're
that's
always
right.
saying, I wish I wouldn't have ruined that relationship with my sister 30 years ago. I wish I had a better relationship with my son. I wish I was a better mother. I mean, whatever it might be. So I think that I like what you're saying, is that it can really, provide us with a lot of insight if we're open to, I guess, getting those lessons. And if it's not too late and on our deathbed, that we're
Yeah,
getting those lessons. Yeah.
that's right. And so what you just said there, if I can, just to sort of sew up, the great question that you ask. I mean, in addition to community or to a felt sense for the need for resistance, I think what you're touching on very nicely is the notion that suffering sometimes can lead to sort of a quest. I don't know of a better word for it. You can get into archetypes, you can get into the hero's journey. But this is the idea that, when we recognize in our suffering that we're in a place of chaos, living amongst the broken integrity or the lack of intactness in our lives, and we look up and say, things must change for me. Sometimes that gives rise to a kind of engagement in the restitution of the things that we might have done wrong, the ways in which we want to sojourn forward, like you said, the way in which we want to conceive of and open up new possibilities for relationship, for knowledge, for training, again, for habits of thinking and feeling and being with. And so, Quest sometimes has a symbolic edge to it in that it points to and participates in a larger kind of experience or fullness of life that we're seeking to get, that suffering sort of insists upon us that it's time to break ground upon. So,
And how do people, though, because there's a fine line of suffering and complete devastation and just loss of all sense of purpose and giving up, right?
yeah,
So there's like a level of suffering where if we engage enough and are open enough, we can use it to enlighten ourselves and better our circumstances, our life choices, our perspectives, etc. But then
yeah,
there's also that fine line, because suffering, you're already in a pretty deep level of pain
that's
and you can
right.
tumble in the other direction. So how does somebody like open themselves up and say, you know what, I want to use this crappy experience to do something
Yeah,
better in my life, but if I open up this wound too much, I'm going to tumble and I'm never going to recover. Like
that's right.
how does someone find that balance?
Yes. So often, particularly in sort of Western philosophy, Western sort of theology, there is oftentimes a starting point on the individual, willing his or herself, for example, into these new frontiers of changing lives, overcoming suffering, and so on. I actually think that the recipe for addressing suffering is even simpler than that, but it's intrapsychic. I think if you look at most of the sacred texts amongst the great religious traditions, and even if you just get into clinical therapeutic approaches, whether it's psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, they all have the ingredients of the need for a testimony about the narrative of the suffering to someone who can hear it. It's a simple recipe for complicated people. And yet I think it's in the context of that relationship of being able to try to generate, whether it's language vis-a-vis art, music, maybe it's verbal, maybe it's nonverbal, but to try to, when one is suffering, to find a voice for it in all of these metaphorical ways, and then to have that voice heard, to have the testimony really received, I think is crucial. It's in that kind of intrapsychic sharing and hearing that I think the ground of healing begins to sort of emerge, the ground of new possibility, the ground of knowing one's not alone. The capacity to be heard, I think, swims directly up against the stream of powerlessness because one is in the position of giving a sort of rudimentary shape to the experience that's happening. So really apathy and silence in the experience of suffering are the really dangerous places, I think, that have roads or taproots that may lead to the kind of suffering that can be world destroying. So anything that we can do around testimony, encouraging the narrative, and having somebody be on the receiving end of that. I know it's simple, but simple recipe for complicated people.
But I love that, a simple recipe for complicated people. That's so important, Nate. I'm so
We can
glad
all
you
do it.
said it. I'm so glad you said it in such an eloquent way. And it is a simple recipe. You're right. And that can generate so much healing within us. And you're mentioning all the different ways. It's not even just conversations. It could be music. It could be
Yeah,
arts. I think it's something, I don't know if this is off topic, but like that animals give to us, right? That our animals,
absolutely.
we
Huge.
feel understood
Absolutely.
and loved and accepted for who we are from an animal. So there are so many ways where we can
Yes,
feel like someone is getting us, understanding us, and that does create a community, right? People who
that's right.
love a particular song, it's because they're
That's right.
connecting to the lyrics of that song or the music, and
Exactly.
then it creates a community. So, and it is a very simple thing. And I'm wondering, as you were saying this, my mind was kind of spiraling off, and I was wondering if that's what's happening out there with social media is that people are
Oh
feeling
yeah.
like within their confines of whatever their usual people are, they're not able to connect and find someone who really listens and understands and gives support. And they're putting themselves out there and they're taking this feedback from people that they don't even know to kind of fill holes that they're not able to generate within like their circle. I mean, that might be way off topic, but I don't know
No,
why
I
it just
think
popped
it's
in my
right. I
head.
think it's right on. And part of what we've learned in the past year, and you know this from, your clinical work, and for me from, teaching through Zoom and all these different, sort of, new channels of communication that have become ordinary and common now. But, I remember when this process began, could you engage in an empathic kind of momentum with the student, with the patient on the other side of the Zoom lens? And of course, it's different than the kind of experience you can generate and have in person. And at the same time, there are strands of serendipity, I think, to your point. Social media, I think, can provide elements that are crucial to the kind of felt sense of being heard and to gathering support, just like we can do via Zoom, just like you and I are doing now.
Yeah.
So it's not exactly the same as sitting around a table looking at one another. It's not the same as a kind of physical kind of embrace. And yet there is something there that's important, perhaps even crucial, that can be generated. And so it's a mixed bag,
Yeah,
obviously.
I think it is. And yesterday I was posting about my almost, I feel like inhumane behavior, even though I'm not doing anything intentionally, and visiting my clients and having to wear masks and shields and stand
Hmm.
distance. And my clients are crying. These people who are in their 80s and 90s trying to tell me about their life, and they have dementia. So they're completely confused anyways. And it's just the
Yeah.
suffering is coming out, but they can't necessarily make sense to it or verbalize it. And here I
Hmm.
am masked up. They can't even see and
Yeah.
understand that I'm listening and I am trying to be compassionate or hold that hand. There's so many barriers that we have right now, having to use technology and cover ourselves to showing that compassion when someone is suffering and really being present for them.
I love what you just said, and I absolutely am on the same page. That mask wearing really does tamp down the ability to have that empathic engagement really felt by the person who's talking. And so you, even walking past people on the street, you can't really, there's this confusion of, are they smiling at me? Did they say hi? Are
Exactly.
they talking on their phones? So
I know. I
it's
know what
bewildering and
it, it
confusing, and it
it
is
is.
difficult.
It is, and it's hard for the healthcare professionals, and it's
It sure
also hard
is.
for the patient.
Yeah.
So what can I know we're getting tight on time here. Is it
Hmm.
okay if we run over to like 35 minutes? Are you going to be okay, or do you need to go?
Yeah. No, no. I'm having fun. Let's keep going.
Okay, good, because I want to talk about now the perspective of healthcare professionals.
Yeah.
How
Hmm.
do we, from our position, help somebody identify when there's some level of suffering, whether that's physical, emotional, spiritual, psychological, and create, first of all, a space and an opportunity for that person to identify
Yes.
and express where they're feeling. Because we
Yeah.
know, especially being in hospice, that people can say they have physical pain and no level of morphine in the world is going to help that person if what they're really having is a spiritual crisis. We know
Yes.
that it's completely interconnected. And so I think
Hmm.
our curative medical model needs to open up and recognize that
Yes.
we needed to address all of the other types of suffering and pain that people are feeling to have our curative medical model work in its most effective way as well. So
Yes.
where do you think healthcare professionals can start in terms of helping their patients one-on-one in the context in which we're living? Second
Yeah.
question of that is, and what is our responsibility as healthcare professionals to help change and help our medical system evolve to include care to
Yeah.
the whole self in that way?
It's such a crucial question, and you and I spoke a little bit about this before this discussion this morning. But to me, the biggest barrier, whether it's social work, psychotherapists, chaplains, physicians, especially nurses, nurse practitioners, biggest barrier to good patient care, if you ask most folks, is time.
Yeah.
I don't have enough time. if you look statistically at, the normal patient interview with a doctor, it continues to get more and more truncated. Healthcare literacy continues to get lower and lower because we have such fractured, such highly specialized, quick engagements with all these subject matter experts that oftentimes the depth and profundity of the experience of suffering isn't we don't even have time to get into the layers. So we focus on blood gas level, we focus on the immediate, what's the MRI result, what's the PET scan, procedural things like, well, because of this, now we're going to look at a transfer to a skilled nursing facility, or we're going to, a board and care situation. So much of our focus, I think, clinically is really caught up in just trying to serve the most basic physical aspects of what we're seeing in our patients. And of course, when we know, when we really have time to engage patients, that it's, like you said very well, it's so often not living forever, but rather having quality of life improve, having family close, healing relationships that have fissures or that have been torn, having opportunities to say goodbye, all these sorts of what we might call end of life, discussions, but we could just say human discussions. Palliative care, for all the different fanciful definitions we could provide, is really just good patient-centered care that prioritizes what the patient's goals are first as a starting point, and then works from there to achieve a care plan. But time really is the issue for most of us. And of course, that comes down from a systematic level, at least in the States, where there's hospital administrators, for example, are really, up against it, trying to meet certain sort of, financial and sort of bureaucratic and regulatory, expectations and hurdles and milestones. So it's complicated, but I really believe the capacity to have time to engage in someone's narrative, to let them provide their testimony. It's not efficient, but that's, I think, something that we're able to do. Most caregivers, most helping professionals want to do, and I think we're getting better. That is to say, not only with this curative model, but integrating this model of treating suffering. You don't have to choose between the two. The history of healthcare has been historically one of trying to treat suffering. The nature and goal of healthcare has been palliative in nature up until about the 1950s, when it really took a hard turn into what we now call the curative model. And no reason to be simple-minded. Most of us really deeply benefit from the curative model. We're living almost twice as long, infant mortality's down, on and on. But I think we're coming back to the importance of, yes, quantity of life is great, but how do we refine, extend quality of life? Because it's not just about me, it's about the people who are around me that are affected in their grief and their questions that go unanswered. So taking the time to hear what's going on with the patient, taking the time to hear what's going on with the family members, which hospice does so beautifully, to treat the patient and the family, or family of choice, as a unit of care, is crucial.
Exactly. You're hitting on everything. I'm presenting tomorrow for the Alzheimer's Society, and my topic is team caregiving. So I'm talking about so much of the healthcare professionals operating in silos, needing to treat just whatever the presenting issue is for them, not communicating with one another, and just hand picking out the patient, and forgetting that there's an entire family system involved, and whatever intervention we're hoping to deliver to the patient's not going to be effective unless the whole family system has some support too.
That's right.
And you're absolutely right, Nate. I mean, hospice does this so well, and I wish we could take that model of hospice and just like plant it into every single medical system, because hospice is so open to everything. You want to bring in Reiki? Sure. You want some massage? Absolutely. Animal therapy? Absolutely. It's like there's no questions about the lengths that we'll go to help relieve and heal people's suffering, and whatever that is, and defined by them. So I love what you're saying. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think before we end this conversation, it's crucial to let folks know, if they don't, about palliative care. Palliative care is a medical, specialty, relatively new, 10 years, but of course, it's ancient. It's been around as long. And the focus of palliative care, of course, is not just to mitigate suffering, but it's to provide an adjunctive, supportive layer to what might be aggressive curative treatments. You don't have to forego curative treatments, and you don't have to be dying to get a palliative care consult. You just have to have some kind of serious illness that might benefit from some kind of pain management. So the question that you're asking, when my students, for example, say, hey, Nate, I took this class with you a couple of years ago, it was really important, but now so many of the themes have come directly into my life. I have a loved one, they're in Topeka, Kansas, and what should I do? And almost always the first thing I say is get a palliative care consult. That doesn't mean the patient is dying. That doesn't mean we're abandoning hope. That's a crazy, misinformed kind of myth about hospice anyhow. It's always about hope, extending and improving quality of life for every second that we have left. So it's absolutely about hope. But palliative care is underutilized, profoundly underutilized. And it's a great place to start because palliative care physicians and the palliative care team members are trained to listen actively, to sense suffering, and to make distinctions between bone pain, muscle pain, nerve pain, emotional pain. And they take the time, take the time to really sojourn alongside the patient and his or her family, answer questions, make themselves available in ways in which other hospital services may not have the capacity to do so. So palliative care, crucial, I think, in terms of our medical model in trying to intervene in this question of suffering.
Yeah, I think being a palliative care social worker really shaped, because I did that very early on in my career, and I think it's really shaped how I've internalized my role as a social worker and what my responsibility is professionally, ethically, and just even as a human being to my clients, because I know what it can be like. And so I sort of like have set this bar really high that it should always be like this. Nate, I know you do, you see people in private practice. So, but right now, basically you could see anybody from anywhere, right? Because you can do this view. Okay. So how do people get a hold of you?
Email is a good way. I'm not as social media sort of saturated as you are and some other people that I really admire and like and listen to. There's an opportunity to contact me by email, and any Google search will yield that, but we could put it into the bio as well.
Yeah, so I'll put it in the comments section when I post a video. I'll put the email that you and I have been using is what you want me to use. I'll put it in the comments section. Okay, so if people want to reach you, they know how to do that. Thank you so much, Nate, for being a part of this really important conversation. We've solved the world's problems related to suffering.
There you go. All right, well,
after
that. Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. Thank you for your interest in this. Thank you for all the podcasts and the talks, and the books and all that you've contributed. We're all learning from each other, with each other, alongside each other. And so anytime, I get to have this conversation, it's a great gift. So thank you.
Excellent. Okay, hang on. I'm going to end the broadcast, but hang on for a sec.
Okay, cool.
Bye, everybody.